The mop bucket had a broken wheel. It had been broken for 6 weeks. Dara dragged it anyway, the rubber squeaking against the metal floor of sub-level 4, that low grinding sound echoing through the maintenance corridor like it always did at this hour. Nobody came down here at night. Nobody ever had a reason to. The pipes ran overhead in thick bundles, orange with age, sweating condensation onto the floor. The ore lining in the walls was thick enough that even the station's internal comms cut in and out down here. Dara had complained about that once. Nobody had fixed it. He had stopped complaining about things 3 years ago. He worked the mop in long, slow strokes. The floor never looked dirty enough to clean and never looked clean enough to stop. That was the nature of sub-level 4. Coolant dripped from somewhere behind panel C9, the same panel he had reported 14 times. The drain at the far end smelled like burnt copper. These were the constants of his world, and he knew them the way other men knew their own names. Above him, 4,000 people were going about their evening. Traders arguing over dock fees in the upper market. Crew running diagnostics on refueling rigs. A diplomat from some outer colony eating dinner in the station's single decent restaurant. Children in the residential block being put to bed. Dara had cleaned every floor they walked on. He knew the station better than anyone alive, because everyone else only ever saw the parts that mattered to them. He had seen all of it. He was wringing out the mop when the lights flickered. Not a power cut, not a surge, just a single, brief stutter, like the station had blinked. Dara looked up at the tube lighting above him. It steadied. He looked at his bucket. He went back to work. Then the noise stopped. He did not notice it at first because silence is not a sound. But Outpost Crestfall was never truly silent. There was always the hum of the ventilation, the distant thud of cargo lifts, the low murmur of voices traveling through walls and floors the way voices always do on a lived-in station. All of it had been there a moment ago. Now it was gone. Not reduced. Gone. Dara stood still for a long moment, mop in hand. He walked to the service ladder and climbed. 1 level. 2. He pushed open the hatch to sub-level 5 and looked out into the corridor. A man was standing 20 meters away, facing the wall. Just standing there. Not moving. Not speaking. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were open. Dara could see that much from where he crouched on the ladder. The man was a dock worker. Dara recognized the orange vest. He had mopped the floor around this man's boots dozens of times. Dara said his name. The man did not react. Dara climbed out fully and walked toward him. He waved a hand in front of the man's face. The eyes moved. They tracked the motion, but the man said nothing. There was no expression. Not confusion, not fear, not the blank look of someone sleepwalking. It was something worse than all of those. It was the look of someone who had no idea there was anything to express. As if the part of him that knew how to be a person had simply been switched off. Dara checked his pulse. Strong and steady. He checked his breathing. Normal. He went up another level. They were everywhere. Sitting, standing, lying down where they had fallen without catching themselves. A woman was slumped at a corridor terminal, her fingers still resting on the keys. A child sat on the floor outside the residential block, legs straight out, staring at nothing. An off-duty pilot leaned against the wall outside the crew lounge, mouth slightly open, breathing slow and even, alive in every mechanical sense and absent in every other. Dara moved through them quietly. He counted. He checked pulses. He did not touch anything he did not need to touch. Old habits. He found Director Bale outside the administrative office on level 7. The man was seated on the floor with his back against the door, as if he had simply sat down mid-step. Dara crouched in front of him and looked at his face for a long time. Bale had hired him 11 years ago without much ceremony, handed him a keycard and a supply list, and told him to keep the lower levels clean because nobody else wanted to. That had been the full extent of their relationship. But Dara had respected the man. He had been fair. There was nothing there now. Dara stood up. He looked down the long corridor, at the still bodies and the empty faces and the absolute silence of 4,000 living people who were no longer home. He did not shout. He did not run. He did not stand there and grieve, because grief was a thing you did when it was over, and it was not over. He went back down to sub-level 4. He sat on the floor next to his broken-wheeled mop bucket. He pressed his back against the ore-lined wall. He breathed slowly, the way a man breathes when he is deciding something serious, and then he began to think. Outside, beyond the station's hull, a A Cerati vessel sat in perfect silence. No lights. No broadcast. It had arrived without warning, and it would leave the same way, once the work was confirmed complete. Vora stood at the observation window and watched the station drift. Clean, she thought. Efficient. She did not know about the heat signature on sub-level 4. Not yet. The supply closet on sub-level 4 was 3 meters wide and smelled like industrial solvent. Dara had always kept it organized in a way no one had ever asked him to. Shelves labeled in his own handwriting. Chemical stocks rotated by expiry date. A small fold-out stool he had salvaged from a broken equipment cart 2 years ago. He sat on it now with the stool tucked between 2 shelving units. The door pulled to, but not latched, and he worked through everything he knew. 1. The pulse had hit everything above sub-level 5. The ore lining in the walls down here had blocked it. He did not know the exact physics of that. He did not need to. 2. 4,000 people were alive, but hollow. Bodily functions intact, cognitive presence gone. He had seen enough field trauma to know the difference between injury and erasure. This was erasure. 3. Whatever ship had done this would send people in. You did not run an operation like this and then leave without confirming the result. He had maybe 2 hours before boots hit the docking bay. Possibly less. He left the closet and moved through the corridor with his torch low, checking the maintenance ducts that ran along the east side of the level. He had crawled every one of them at some point, clearing blockages or tracing leaks. He knew which ones connected where and which ones were too corroded to use safely. Third duct from the water recycling junction. He had replaced a seal in there 4 months ago. Dry, clean, wide enough for a person. He heard the sound before he reached it. A small, high noise. Not mechanical. He stopped and crouched and waited. It came again, faint, from inside the duct opening. Not words. Just breath, fast and frightened. He pulled the grate off slowly and shone the torch inside. A child. Small, slight, alien, pale gray skin, large dark eyes, the wide flat nose of a species he had seen on the station before. Neutral traders, he thought. Outer corridor vendors. The child was pressed flat against the inner wall with her arms around her knees, staring at the light without blinking. Dara lowered the torch so it was not pointing at her face. He sat back on his heels. He did not reach in. The child stared at him. He waited. After a while, she moved. Slowly, the way a small animal moves when it has decided the threat level is acceptable. She crawled to the duct opening and looked at him properly. She was young. He could not judge the age well for her species, but young. She signed something with her hands. A quick, precise gesture. He did not know the language. He pointed to himself. Dara, he said quietly. She pointed to herself. She signed again, something short. She said nothing aloud. He would learn later that she was mute, not from the pulse, but from birth. Her name sign was 2 fingers touching the side of her jaw. He named her Sola in his head because he needed something to call her, and it was the word that came to him, and she did not object when he used it. He brought her into the supply closet. He gave her a protein bar from his work bag and a foil emergency blanket from the first aid kit on the wall. He set her on the fold-out stool and went back out to work. He raided the station's emergency food stores on sub-level 4. There were 2 of them, placed there for exactly this kind of disaster, never opened, probably forgotten by the administration years ago. He brought back enough for several days. He filled 2 maintenance jugs with clean water from the recycling tap. He found a second first aid kit behind a junction panel and added it to the pile. By the time the first Cerati boarding team reached the upper levels, Dara was back behind the ore-lined walls, still and quiet, watching through a ventilation grate near the sub-level 5 hatch. They moved in groups of 4, armored, but not heavily. This was a cataloging mission, not a combat one. They moved through the empty crowds of hollow survivors with the efficiency of people doing a job they had done before, scanning each person with a small handheld device, logging data. No cruelty, no interest, just process. That was, somehow, worse than anger would have been. Dara watched their rotation. He counted the seconds between passes. He noted which doors they sealed and which they ignored. He looked at their boots, because boots told you how long someone expected to be standing, and these had thin soles. They expected to be back on their ship within hours. Short operation. They would confirm the erasure, catalog the survivors as inert, and leave a skeleton crew to hold the station until a transport arrived. He had a narrow window. He memorized 3 patrol routes before he pulled himself back from the grate and returned to Sola. She had eaten half the protein bar and was holding the foil blanket around her shoulders, watching the door. When he came in, she looked at him with those large dark eyes and signed something he did not understand. He shook his head slowly to show he had not understood. She paused, then pointed at the ceiling, toward the upper levels, and made a slow, sweeping gesture with her palm, as if wiping a surface clean. Dara looked at her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's about right." She lowered her hand and looked at the floor. He sat down with his back against the shelving and let himself be still for 1 minute. 1 minute was all he would allow. Then he picked up his torch, pulled out the station's maintenance schematic from the back pocket of his work vest, a laminated fold-out he had carried for 11 years, and started planning. There is a pipe on sub-level 6, junction 14C, that has been leaking for 2 years. Not badly. A slow seep at the joint, just enough to keep the floor wet in a 2-meter radius. Dara had reported it 8 times. The last time, he had been told it was low priority and to put a wet floor sign out. He had done that. The sign was still there. He had thought about that sign 100 times since then and felt nothing about it. Now he thought about it again and felt something close to gratitude. He opened the manual valve behind panel C14 at 0300 station time, while the Cerity patrol was at the far end of level 6 on their rotation. The pipe joint gave immediately. It had been waiting 2 years for exactly this, and cold gray water flooded across the corridor floor in a wide, fast sheet, running into the junction alcove and triggering the level 6 moisture sensor. The alarm was soft. A facility maintenance alert. Not a security alarm. There was no reason for it to be. Just a quiet, persistent tone that meant water somewhere. The patrol rerouted. Dara was already gone, 2 levels down, moving through the access tunnel behind the power distribution units. He had his torch off. He did not need it. He had walked that tunnel in the dark before, following a fault in the lighting rig, and his hands remembered the distance between the handholds. He did this 3 times over the next 12 hours. Each act small. Each act deniable. A coolant alarm triggered by a disconnected sensor wire on level 3. A docking clamp on bay 7 that released its magnetic lock when Dara pulled the manual override lever behind the service panel, a lever he had used twice before during routine maintenance. The clamp disengaging made a sound like a distant gunshot. It sent a Cerity technical team to bay 7 for 40 minutes. 40 minutes was enough time to map their command post on level 9. He found it by following the power draw. The station's internal monitoring system was still partially active on the maintenance terminals in sub-level 4, because nobody had thought to shut down the building management network. It was not a communications system. It was not a weapons system. It was the thing that told you when a filter needed replacing. Dara had used it every day for 11 years. He called up the power consumption grid and watched for the anomaly, a cluster of high draw points on level 9 that had not been there before. Equipment. Their equipment. He did not go to level 9. He did not need to. He sketched the layout on the back of his maintenance schematic and kept moving. Ren found the coolant alarm first. He was 23 years old by Cerity count, assigned to technical operations, and he was precise in the way young people are precise when they have been trained well and have not yet been surprised enough times to develop instinct. He stood in front of the disconnected sensor wire on level 3 and turned it over in his hands and looked at the connector point. Clean break. No corrosion. No mechanical fatigue. Someone had pulled this deliberately. He filed a note in the operations log. Equipment degradation, possible, under investigation. He did not tell Vora. He was not sure why. He told himself it was because he wanted to verify before reporting. That was technically true. Dara found the relay node on level 8. He had been looking for it since he first identified the erasure pulse as something installed rather than something fired from the ship. A weapon like that needed a local anchor, something inside the station to focus the signal, to make sure it saturated every corner. He had been narrowing it down by process of elimination, marking off rooms he had cleared on his schematic. It was in the secondary environmental control room, behind the atmospheric processing unit. A black rectangular device, about the size of a large equipment case, bolted to the wall with 4 anchor points. It had a small display screen that read, in Cerity script he could not read, something that was probably a status message. 2 Cerity guards stood outside the environmental control room on rotating watch. Dara lay flat in the ventilation shaft above the room for 11 minutes, looking down through the grate at the device. He could not destroy it. Not yet. It was guarded, and destroying it might trigger an alert, and he did not yet have a plan for what came after the alert. He needed a plan for what came after. Blowing the device, and then having nowhere to go was not resistance. It was just noise. He pulled out the maintenance scanner from his vest, a small unit used for logging equipment faults, carried by every cleaner on the station, and photographed the device through the grate. 17 images. Every angle he could get. Then he photographed the anchor points, the cable routing, the power feed junction on the wall beside it. He took his time. There was no rush. The guards below him were not looking up. Nobody ever looked up in a maintenance shaft. Nobody ever thought about what moved through the spaces between the walls. When he was done, he backed out of the shaft and returned to sub-level 4. Sola was awake, sitting cross-legged on the stool, watching the door. When he came in, she looked at his face and read something there. She was good at that. He was learning, and she made a slow gesture with both hands, palms open, held forward. He did not know the word for it in her language. In his, it meant, "I'm here." Dara sat down on the floor, spread the maintenance schematic between them, and pointed to the level 8 room. Then he pointed to the cable routing in his scanner image. Then he pointed to his own chest. Sola watched him for a moment. Then she pointed to herself. He shook his head. She pointed to herself again, firmly, with the particular stubbornness of a child who has already decided. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he went back to the schematic and started working out the approach. Vora did not sleep the way biological species slept. She rested in a chair in the command room of her vessel, eyes open, processing the day's data in the slow, organized way she had trained herself to do. Reports from the boarding teams, catalog numbers, estimated transport timeline. The operation was clean. The station was secured. There was nothing to think about except completion. At 0410 station time, she ran a stability check on the erasure pulse and fired a second one. It was standard procedure. The first pulse handled the initial erasure. The second was a consolidation measure, designed to confirm the work was permanent, to eliminate any possibility of partial recovery. It lasted for seconds. It reached every level of the station, filled every corridor, passed through every wall. Except, the sensors told her afterward, through a dense band of or lined infrastructure running through sub-level 4. She pulled up the data 3 times because the first 2 seemed like instrument error. The third confirmed it. There was a section of sub-level 4, roughly 40 meters of corridor, a storage cluster, and some adjacent service rooms, where the pulse had not penetrated. Not due to failure, due to physical shielding. Natural or content in the original construction material, thick enough and the right composition to absorb the frequency entirely. It was a known vulnerability in the pulse design. It had never mattered before, because no station they had used this on had that specific or profile in inhabited areas, and this station only had it in the sub-maintenance levels. The sub-maintenance levels were not inhabited. Except they were, apparently. She reviewed the thermal imaging from the past 22 hours. The system had logged it, and she had simply not checked, because there was nothing in sub-level 4 that required checking. A maintenance corridor. Pipes. Storage. One heat signature. Moving. Moving with direction and purpose and a pattern that was not random and not distressed. She overlaid the signature's path onto the station schematics and felt something in her thinking shift. It had visited the level 3 sensor junction 3 hours before the coolant alarm triggered. It had been near Bay 7 before the docking clamp released. It had spent 11 minutes directly above the environmental control room on level 8. Vora sat with this information for a while. One human. No weapons on record. No rank. The station manifest listed one maintenance worker assigned to sub-level 4. Dara, contracted civilian, 11 years of service, no security flags. She pulled his personnel file. It was 4 lines long. Previous employment, field medical, military, honorably discharged. Current employment, station cleaner. Notes, reliable. That was all. She sent a full fire team into the lower levels at 0500. 8 soldiers, full armor, stun weapons, and live weapons both. She told them to bring the anomaly in for questioning. She was curious about it. She had not been curious about anything in this operation until now. The fire team descended to sub-level 4 and swept it in a standard grid pattern. They found nothing. No person. No child, because she had reviewed the full thermal record by then and found the second, smaller signature as well. No signs of habitation in the supply closet beyond a folded foil blanket and an empty protein bar wrapper, which could have been there for months. They found a clean corridor, a working mop bucket with one broken wheel, and a standard wet floor sign near junction 14C. In the center of the main corridor, placed with a precision that was not accidental, was a mop. Standing upright, handle pointing at the ceiling, leaning against nothing, just left there, in the exact middle of the floor, in a corridor that had been thoroughly swept by 8 armed soldiers who had found no one. The team leader photographed it and sent the image to Vora. She looked at it for a long time. It was not aggression. It was not a threat. It was something worse than both of those, and it took her a moment to identify what it was. It was acknowledgement. Whatever was moving through sub-level 4 knew she had sent the team. It had already moved, and it had left something behind to make sure she understood that it knew. A mop. In the middle of the floor. Ren was standing at the operations terminal when she pulled up the thermal data and began cross-referencing it with the sabotage incidents. He watched her work without speaking. He had filed his note about the level 3 sensor wire 3 hours ago. He had not mentioned it aloud. Now he watched Vora build the same picture he had already half built, and he understood, with a cold and specific clarity, that his silence had cost nothing and explained nothing, and that the situation had continued regardless. He thought about the sensor wire. Clean break. Not degradation. Someone had stood there with their hands and pulled it apart and walked away. He thought about what it meant that the station's maintenance worker had not run, had not hidden permanently, had not tried to broadcast a distress signal or barricade a room, had moved, quietly, continuously, like someone with a plan. Vora turned from the display. Her expression was not alarmed. It was focused in the way that meant she had reclassified something. One human, she said. A cleaner. Ren nodded because it seemed like a response was expected. Increase the internal sensor sweep frequency. Continuous thermal monitoring, all levels, all corridors. And seal the maintenance shaft access points above sub-level 5. Ren said yes and began entering the commands. His hands were steady. His thoughts were not. Somewhere below them, in the line dark of sub-level 4, Dara had already found the third route. The maintenance scanner had a broadcast function. Dara had used it twice in 11 years. Once to log an equipment fault when the terminal was offline. Once to ping the supply depot on level 2 when the wrong chemicals had been delivered. It could transmit data packets to any terminal on the station's internal network. Short range, low power, designed for logging faults and nothing else. But the station's internal network connected to the external comm relay on level 10. And the external comm relay connected to everything. The question was not whether he could route a signal outward. He was fairly certain he could, if he accessed the relay node directly, because the node was the most powerful transmitter on the station by a significant margin. The question was what to transmit, and to whom, and how to make sure it reached someone who could not be brushed aside or quietly intercepted. The Interstellar Neutral Observer Core operated on a secured Cerity administrative frequency, a frequency the Dominion had helped establish 20 years ago as a gesture of diplomatic goodwill, a proof that they respected neutral oversight. Dara had learned this from a briefing document he had found in a recycling bin outside the administrative office 4 years ago. Director Bale had been preparing for an inspection visit. Dara had read the document because he read everything that came through his hands, out of a habit he could not fully explain, and had filed it in the back of his memory the way he filed all things, without knowing why, just in case. That frequency, broadcast through the relay node with Cerity command codes embedded in the header, would be treated as a priority distress call. The observers would respond. The Cerity could not shoot them. The Dominion had spent 20 years constructing a reputation as a civilized power. One engagement against neutral observers would collapse that entirely. This was the plan. It had 3 problems. The first was that the relay node was on level 8 with 2 guards outside the door. The second was that Dara did not have the Cerity command codes. The third was that Sola did. She had shown him 3 days ago, without him asking, pulled a small data chip from inside the collar of her tunic and held it out to him with both hands. He had looked at it and looked at her, and she had made a gesture he had come to understand meant, I was carrying this for someone. He did not know who. He did not ask. The chip contained a full Cerity diplomatic access packet, the kind used by neutral party trade observers to authenticate communications on Cerity networks. Someone had trusted a small mute child to carry it out of somewhere. He did not know the story. He only knew it was exactly what he needed. He left Sola in the secondary location, a sealed pump room behind the water recycling unit, dry and warm, and stocked with 2 days of food, and moved out at 0200 station time. The thermal sweep frequency had increased. He knew that because he had watched the sensor ping intervals on the maintenance terminal and counted them. They were now every 4 minutes instead of every 12. He moved during the 4-minute windows, staying in the ore-lined sections as long as possible, crossing exposed corridors in under 90 seconds, pressing flat against cold walls and waiting. He reached level 8 through a route that did not exist on the official schematics, a gap behind the atmospheric processing unit that had been walled off during a renovation 7 years ago, but not sealed completely. He had found the gap while chasing a coolant smell long before any of this, and had fit himself through it twice to confirm it was passable. The relay node room had 2 guards at the door and none inside. He came through the ceiling. The ventilation grate above the node room released from the inside with a half-turn of a flat tool. Any flat tool, Dara used the edge of his access card. He lowered himself down between the node and the atmospheric processor, and he went to work. He did not destroy the node. He rewired it. It took 26 minutes. He had practiced the sequence on a drawn diagram 11 times in the supply closet with Sola watching. The power feed remained intact. The broadcast antenna remained intact. He rerouted the targeting signal, the component that directed the pulse inward, and connected it to the external comm relay output instead. He loaded Sola's data chip into the scanner. He composed the transmission header using the diplomatic access codes, setting the origin identifier to read as a Cerity administrative beacon. He set the signal to broadcast on a continuous loop, carrying 2 things: the Cerity distress protocol that would bring observers to the station, and a compressed data file that contained everything: the thermal imaging timestamps, his maintenance scanner photographs of the node, the patrol logs he had reconstructed from memory, and a written account of what he had found on the upper levels when he had first climbed out of sub-level 4. He was about to activate it when the door opened. Not the corridor door. The internal service door on the far wall, which Dara had not known was there because it was not on the schematic. And through it came Ren, alone, carrying nothing, his hands visible and open, the way a person holds their hands when they want to be very clear that they are not a threat. They looked at each other across the dim room. The node hummed between them. Ren looked at Dara's hands on the wiring. He looked at the scanner. He read none of it, but he understood all of it, the way you understand a fire even if you have never seen one before. He said nothing. Dara said quietly, "What do you think happens to a power that does this and faces no consequence?" Ren looked at the floor, then at the door behind him, then at Dara. He stepped to the side. He put his back against the wall. He looked at the ceiling. Dara pressed the activation key. Somewhere on the command deck of Vora's vessel, a light turned red. She leaned forward and read the frequency. Her expression did not change, but her hands went still on the console, and they stayed still for a long time. The observer core vessels arrived in 4 hours and 17 minutes. 3 ships. White hulls with the core's gray band running the full length of each one. They dropped out of FTL in a tight formation and held position at 500 kilometers, which was close enough to mean business and far enough to mean they were not attacking. They broadcast on the Cerity administrative frequency, the same one Dara's signal had used, and requested immediate access to Outpost Crestfall under the Neutral Oversight Accord, Article 9, which pertained to suspected mass civilian harm. Vora did not respond for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Dara sat on the floor of the node room with his back against the wall, and Ren sitting 3 meters away, neither of them speaking. The node still broadcast. Ren had not attempted to stop it. He had not moved from the wall. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and breathed in the careful way of someone thinking through something they cannot unthink. When Vora's boarding recall order came through the station's commandeered comm system, Ren stood up. He looked at Dara once. He did not say anything. He left through the service door. Dara stayed where he was until the Cerity teams had fully withdrawn, then went back down to the pump room for Sola. She was awake and standing at the door when he arrived, foil blanket folded and set on the floor next to the food supplies, as if she had already decided they were leaving and had been waiting for him to catch up. He picked up the blanket. She picked up the remaining food. They walked to the docking bay together. The observers came aboard within the hour. They were a mixed team. 3 species, none of them human. All of them carrying the particular careful energy of people trained to document rather than intervene. They moved through the upper levels with recording equipment and medical scanners, cataloging the hollow survivors, logging body positions, documenting the silence of 4,000 people who were breathing steadily and registering nothing. Dara gave his account in a room off the docking bay, seated across from 2 observers, with Sola next to him. He spoke for a long time. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make it more than it was. He said what he had seen, what he had done, what the node had been and where it was, and what it had been used for. He pulled out his maintenance scanner and handed it over. 17 photographs of the relay node. Patrol log reconstructions in his own handwriting on the back of the station schematic. The full timeline. Broken wheel on my mop bucket, Dara said. I was down on sub-level 4 fixing it. He had not been fixing it. He had never fixed it. He had been mopping. But the wheel had kept him down there, and that felt close enough to the truth. Sola gave her testimony through a sign language interpreter the observers brought in from their second vessel. She was precise and clear and entirely without fear. She handed over the data chip. The observer holding it looked at the diplomatic access codes, and then looked at Sola for a long moment with an expression Dara could not read. Ren submitted his voluntary testimony that evening. He filed it directly to the Observer Core record system, which meant it was logged outside Serity jurisdiction the moment he sent it. His account matched Dara's on every point and added operational detail that Dara had not had access to. He described the second pulse. He named the operation. He provided the technical specifications for the erasure relay that Dara had photographed but not been able to read. It was the testimony of a young man who had made a decision in a dark room and was living with the shape of it now. Vora was recalled to Serity command space within 6 hours of the observer's arrival. The recall was framed as administrative. Everyone understood what it was. The 4,200 survivors of Outpost Crestfall could not be restored. The observer's medical team confirmed it within 2 days. Erasure at that depth left the neural architecture intact but emptied, like a building with all the rooms still there and nothing left inside. They could be cared for. They could eat and sleep and walk when guided. They could not remember who they were, or who they had loved, or what their lives had meant. They would need care for the rest of their lives. The relay node was seized as primary evidence. Dara's rewiring had preserved it intact, which meant the observers had the device, the command codes, the activation records, and the technical data all in one place. The Serity Dominion's legal team argued instrument error for 4 days before the weight of the record made that impossible. The tribunal was convened 3 weeks later. It was the first of its kind in 40 years. Dara did not stay for any of it. When the observer team cleared him to leave, he walked back through the station one last time. He did not have anywhere specific to go. He just walked the levels, the empty corridors, the hollow people sitting in the care stations the observers had set up, warm and fed and absent. He found Director Bale in one of them, seated near a viewport, a caregiver nearby. The director's hands were folded in his lap. His eyes were open, watching something outside the viewport that he was not really watching. Dara stood there for a while. Then he found a cloth in his back pocket. He always had a cloth, and he cleaned the viewport. Slowly, the same long strokes he used on every window, on every level. The glass went clear. He did not know if Bale noticed. He did it anyway. Somewhere in the Serity Dominion's internal records, a diplomatic threat assessment was being filed. Standard format. Name, species, occupation, threat classification. The classification field read Class 1 Strategic Threat. It was the highest category on the form. It had previously been used for fleet commanders, weapons scientists, and heads of state. Under occupation, someone had written, cleaner. The file sat in the system for 6 months before a junior archivist flagged it as a probable data entry error. She submitted a correction request. The correction was denied. The original classification was confirmed by 2 senior officers who had reviewed the full operational record and decided, after considerable discussion, that it was accurate. The file remained.